The morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of Roy Wilson's small apartment. He rubbed his eyes, annoyed by the intrusion of light. Another day in the neighborhood he no longer recognized. Roy was 62, with weathered skin that told stories of outdoor work and hard living. His small town had changed over the past 20 years, and he hadn't changed with it. "World's gone crazy," he muttered to himself, the same phrase he repeated most mornings as he made his coffee and toast. His walls were decorated with faded photographs of the good old days, as he called them. Days when he knew all his neighbors, when things made sense to him. Roy had worked at the local factory for 38 years before they closed down. Now he lived on his pension, which wasn't much, but it kept a roof over his head and food on his table. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, and his son rarely called from the city where he'd moved for work. Roy's world had grown smaller, and his heart had hardened along with it. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. Families from different countries and cultures had moved in as housing prices dropped after the factory closure. Roy didn't try to know them. He kept to himself, nursing grudges against changes he couldn't control. His morning routine never varied. Coffee, toast, television news, which only made him angrier, then a walk to the corner store for his newspaper. The walk was his daily reminder of how everything had changed. New restaurants with foreign names, music he didn't understand playing from cars, and faces that didn't look like the ones from his youth. Today was no different as Roy headed out. His worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked with his gaze fixed downward, avoiding eye contact, muttering occasionally when he had to step aside for someone. The young clerk at the corner store had stopped trying to chat with him months ago, now just silently handing over his paper and making change. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called Mrs. Chen from her flower shop. She always tried, despite his grunt in response. Today was no different. Roy took his newspaper and headed back home, planning to spend the day as he always did, alone with his television and his thoughts. But halfway down Pine Street, something disrupted his routine. A crowd had gathered near the small park that separated his street from Oak Avenue. Roy would have kept walking, avoiding whatever commotion was happening, but the crowd blocked his usual path home. "What's going on?" he asked gruffly to no one in particular, trying to see past the gathered people. "Someone's hurt," a young man replied, not turning to see who had asked. Roy was about to turn around and find another route home when he heard someone shout, "Does anyone know first aid?" There was a moment of uncertain murmuring from the crowd. Roy hesitated. Before retirement, all factory workers had been required to learn basic first aid. He'd renewed his certification every 2 years for nearly 4 decades. "I know some," he found himself saying, his voice rough from lack of use. The crowd parted slightly and Roy moved forward reluctantly. On the ground lay a young woman unconscious. She was dressed in running clothes, her headphones still in her ears. Her dark skin contrasted with the pale concrete of the sidewalk. Roy froze for a second. "She just collapsed," said a worried-looking teenager. "We called an ambulance, but they said it might be 15 minutes. Roy's initial instinct was to turn away. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't someone from his world. But something, perhaps the memory of his training or some deeply buried sense of human decency, kept him rooted to the spot. He knelt down awkwardly, his old knees protesting, and checked for breathing. She was breathing, but it seemed shallow. He gently turned her to the recovery position, the movements coming back to him despite the years. "Does anyone know her?" Roy asked, his voice stronger now. "She lives in the blue house on Oak," someone said. "I think her name is Zara. She's a nurse at County." Roy nodded, continuing to monitor her breathing. "Someone should find shade or an umbrella. It's too hot out here." To his surprise, people moved quickly to help. A woman ran to her car and returned with a beach umbrella. Someone else brought a bottle of water. A young man took off his light jacket and placed it gently under Zara's head. Roy stayed beside her, occasionally checking her pulse and making sure she remained in a safe position. His newspaper lay forgotten on the ground nearby. Minutes passed, and Roy became aware that his hand, pale, wrinkled, and spotted with age, was resting just inches from the unconscious woman's arm. The contrast struck him, but not in the way it might have before. Now he just saw human skin, different in shade but the same in purpose, both covering people who bled the same color. The sound of sirens broke through his thoughts. The ambulance had arrived, and paramedics rushed toward them with equipment and a stretcher. She collapsed while running, About 10 minutes ago, Roy explained to the female paramedic who knelt opposite him. Breathing has been steady, pulse is rapid but not irregular. No signs of injury that I could see. She hasn't regained consciousness. The paramedic looked at him with a hint of surprise, perhaps at his competence. Thank you, sir. We'll take it from here. Roy stood up stiffly and stepped back as the professionals took over. They attached monitors, checked vitals, and prepared to transport Zara to the hospital. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, her eyes fluttered open briefly, looking confused and frightened. You're okay, the paramedic told her. You're going to be fine. We're taking you to the hospital. Zara's gaze drifted across the faces of the people gathered around, landing briefly on Roy before her eyes closed again. The paramedics continued their work, and soon they had loaded her into the ambulance. Before they closed the doors, one of them turned to the crowd. Does anyone have her contact information? Family we should call? The crowd looked at each other blankly. They knew where she lived, but nothing more. I can find out, said Mrs. Chen, who had joined the crowd from her flower shop. She buys flowers every Friday for her grandmother who lives with her. I have her phone number at the shop. The paramedic nodded gratefully, and Mrs. Chen hurried away to get the information. The doors closed, the siren wailed, and the ambulance drove away, leaving the crowd to slowly disperse. Roy stood alone, still staring after the ambulance. His daily routine had been thoroughly disrupted, and he felt oddly shaken. He bent down to pick up his newspaper, now wrinkled and a bit dirty. That was good what you did, said a voice beside him. It was Mr. Gupta from the apartment building next to Roy's. They had lived as neighbors for 5 years, but had never spoken beyond the occasional nod. Just remembered some old training, Roy mumbled, uncomfortable with the praise. Still, you stepped up when she needed help, Mr. Gupta persisted. Not everyone would. Roy didn't know how to respond to that. He nodded awkwardly and turned to continue his walk home. But something felt different. The streets looked the same, the buildings unchanged. But Roy felt as if something inside him had shifted slightly, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. At home, he made another cup of coffee and sat in his usual chair, but he couldn't concentrate on his newspaper. His mind kept returning to the young woman, Zara, and the way the crowd had come together to help her. People he'd been avoiding for years, people he'd convinced himself were nothing like him, had shown the same concern he had felt, the same human instinct to protect someone in trouble. The afternoon crawled by, and as the sun began to set, Roy found himself doing something unusual. He picked up his rarely used phone and, after some hesitation, called the county hospital. I'm calling about a young woman brought in earlier today, he said when the receptionist answered. Collapsed while running. Name's Zara. I just wanted to know if she's okay. Are you family, sir? The receptionist asked. No, just a concerned neighbor, Roy replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth. I can't give out patient information to non-family members, she explained. But I can take your name and number and see if the patient wants to contact you. Roy almost hung up then, but instead heard himself saying Wilson, Roy Wilson, and reciting his phone number. He spent the evening in his usual chair, but his eyes kept drifting to the silent phone. He told himself he was being foolish, she wouldn't call, and why should she? He was nobody to her, just some old man who happened to be there when she needed help. As he was preparing for bed, the phone rang, startling him. No one ever called him in the evening. Hello? He answered cautiously. Mr. Wilson? Came a woman's voice, tired but warm. This is Zara Thompson. The hospital said you called to check on me. Roy sat down heavily on the edge of his bed. Yes, I was there when you collapsed. Just wanted to make sure you were all right. They're keeping me overnight for observation, she explained. Severe dehydration and low blood sugar. I've been working double shifts and not taking care of myself properly. The doctor says I'll be fine with rest and fluids. Good, Roy said awkwardly. That's good. There was a pause, and then Zara said, They told me someone helped before the paramedics arrived. Was that you? Just remembered some old training. Roy repeated his words from earlier. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did, she said quietly. Thank you. Roy's throat felt tight. You're welcome, he managed. I'd like to thank you properly when I get out of here, Zara continued. Maybe I could bring you some of my grandmother's famous sweet potato pie. She'll insist once I tell her what happened. Roy was silent for a long moment, caught between old habits and something new stirring within him. That would be nice, he finally said. After they hung up, Roy sat on his bed for a long time looking at the phone in his hand. Tomorrow would be different from all the identical days that had come before it. Tomorrow his routine would change. Tomorrow, a young woman whose life he had touched would touch his life in return. And for the first time in years, Roy Wilson looked forward to tomorrow. Roy woke up earlier than usual the next morning. He'd slept poorly, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. The image of Zara collapsed on the sidewalk kept returning to him, along with the strange feeling that had settled in his chest when he'd spoken to her on the phone. He went through his morning routine with unusual attention to detail. He shaved carefully, nicking himself only once. He put on a clean button-up shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. He even ran a comb through his thinning hair, something he rarely bothered with anymore. "What are you doing, old man?" he muttered to himself in the bathroom mirror, but he knew what he was doing. He was preparing to have a visitor for the first time in years. Zara had said she'd come by in the afternoon, after being discharged from the hospital. Roy had no idea if she'd actually show up. Part of him hoped she wouldn't. It would be easier to return to his familiar isolation than to navigate this uncomfortable new territory. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for a long time, hoped she would come. He spent the morning cleaning his small apartment. It wasn't dirty. Roy had always been neat, but it had the unlived-in feel of a place where someone exists rather than lives. He opened windows to let in fresh air, washed the few dishes in the sink, and even dusted the photographs on his walls. Each one showed moments from his past: Roy and his late wife on their wedding day, his son's high school graduation, the factory softball team holding a trophy, Roy receiving a plaque for 30 years of service. As he dusted the frames, he realized how long it had been since he'd really looked at these images, how long since he'd thought of his life as anything but a slow decline into insignificance. The realization wasn't pleasant, and he pushed it away, focusing instead on making his small home presentable. By noon, he'd run out of things to clean. He made a sandwich but couldn't eat it, his stomach tight with an anxiety he hadn't felt in years. He turned on the television but couldn't focus on the programs. Finally, he settled in his chair with a book he'd read a dozen times before, the familiar words offering some comfort. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a knock at his door. Roy stood up too quickly, his book falling to the floor. He took a deep breath, smoothed his shirt, and walked to the door. When he opened it, Zara stood there looking pale but smiling. Beside her was an elderly woman with the same warm eyes carrying a covered dish. "Mr. Wilson?" Zara said. "I hope we're not too early. This is my grandmother, Mrs. Thompson." The older woman stepped forward, extending the dish. "Sweet potato pie, as promised. Still warm from the oven." Roy stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before remembering his manners. "Please come in," he said, stepping back to allow them entry. The two women walked into his apartment, bringing with them a presence that made the space feel suddenly smaller, yet somehow more alive. Roy took the pie from Mrs. Thompson's hands, unsure what to do next. "Kitchen?" Mrs. Thompson asked with a knowing smile. "Yes, through there," Roy pointed, relieved to have something specific to do. He led the way to his small kitchen and set the pie on the counter. "You have a lovely home," Zara said, though they both knew it wasn't true. His apartment was clean but sparse, functional rather than lovely. "It's enough for me," Roy replied. "Please sit down." He gestured to his small dining table, which he'd cleared of the mail and newspapers that usually covered it. The three of them sat, an uncomfortable silence filling the room for a moment. Roy hadn't entertained guests in so long that he'd forgotten the rhythm of it, the expected small talk and offers of refreshments. Mrs. Thompson saved him. "Do you have plates, Mr. Wilson? And perhaps some coffee to go with the pie?" "Yes, of course," Roy said, grateful for the direction. He busied himself with mugs and plates, putting on a pot of coffee. The familiar tasks calmed his nerves. "Zara tells me you helped her yesterday," Mrs. Thompson said as Roy set mugs on the table. "That was very kind of you." "Anyone would have done it," Roy said, the same words he'd used with Zara on the phone. "But they didn't," Mrs. Thompson echoed her granddaughter's response. "You did. And I'm grateful. This girl works too hard, doesn't take care of herself properly." "Grandma," Zara protested gently, color returning to her cheeks. "It's true. Double shifts at that hospital, then running like you're being chased. The body can only take so much." Roy brought the coffee pot to the table and poured for each of them. "You're a nurse?" he asked Zara, remembering what someone in the crowd had said. She nodded. At County, in the emergency department. I've been there 3 years now. Hardest working girl you'll ever meet, Mrs. Thompson said proudly. First in our family to go to college. Got herself a scholarship and everything. Roy saw Zara's embarrassment at her grandmother's praise, but also the obvious love between them. It reminded him of his own grandmother decades ago, who had bragged about him to anyone who would listen. The pie looks delicious, Roy said, changing the subject as he cut slices for each of them. Old family recipe, Mrs. Thompson said. Been making it for 60 years since I was a girl back in Georgia. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Roy had expected. Mrs. Thompson was a natural storyteller, filling silences with tales of her childhood in the South, her move north as a young woman, and her late husband's work as a mechanic. Zara spoke about her nursing work. Though she skipped over the more difficult parts, Roy noticed, probably to protect her grandmother from worry. Roy found himself sharing stories too, about his years at the factory, about the town as it used to be. He surprised himself with how much he remembered, how many stories he'd left untold for years because there had been no one to tell them to. The factory's gone now, isn't it? Zara asked. A lot of people lost their jobs when it closed. Nearly 800 workers, Roy confirmed. Some found other work, some retired early, some moved away. The town never really recovered. Is that when the neighborhood started to change? Zara asked carefully. Roy looked at her, realizing she understood more than he'd given her credit for. She knew what kind of man he was, or had been. The kind who resented change, who blamed newcomers for the decline of his world. Yes, he admitted. Housing prices dropped. New people moved in. He paused, looking at the two women sitting at his table, sharing his coffee and conversation. People like you. There was a moment of tension, but Mrs. Thompson just nodded. Change is hard, she said simply. Especially when it comes with loss. Roy felt a lump in his throat at her words, at the understanding in them. She wasn't just talking about the factory or the neighborhood. She was talking about his wife, his son who had moved away, his sense of purpose. Yes, he managed to say. It is. Zara reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle, that Roy nearly pulled away. But he didn't. Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Wilson, she said, and for yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Probably someone else would have helped, Roy said, but with less conviction than before. Maybe, Mrs. Thompson said, but it was you who did. That means something. They finished their pie and coffee, and Roy found himself reluctant for them to leave. It had been so long since he'd had real conversation, since he'd felt connected to other people. We should get going, Zara said eventually, looking at her watch. I promised Dr. Patel I'd rest today, and Grandma has her book club tonight. Of course, Roy said, standing up. Thank you for the pie. It was delicious. Keep the rest, Mrs. Thompson insisted. Too much sugar for us. At the door, Roy expected a quick goodbye, but Mrs. Thompson surprised him with a hug. You're welcome at our house anytime, Mr. Wilson. Blue House on Oak Street, can't miss it. Sunday dinner's at 5 if you're interested. Roy didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. And I work Monday through Thursday at the hospital, Zara added. But I'm around on weekends usually. After they left, Roy stood at his window watching them walk down the street. Mrs. Thompson was talking animatedly, her hands moving as she spoke. Zara laughed at something her grandmother said, her head thrown back in genuine amusement. They looked happy, these two women who had entered his life so unexpectedly. They looked like they belonged in this neighborhood that Roy had stopped believing was his. For the rest of the day, Roy's apartment felt different. The silence that had been his constant companion for years now felt heavier, more noticeable. He turned on the radio for background noise, something he rarely did anymore. That night, as he prepared for bed, Roy found himself thinking about Sunday dinner at the Blue House on Oak Street. Would he go? The thought made him nervous, but also gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Before turning out his light, Roy looked at the photograph of his late wife that sat on his nightstand. Things are changing, Mary, he said quietly to the image. I'm not sure what to make of it. He could almost hear her response. About time, Roy Wilson. About time. For the second night in a row, Roy went to bed thinking about tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Days that might not be the same as all the days that had come before. Days that just might be worth looking forward to. Saturday passed slowly for Roy. He found himself checking the clock more often than usual, each hour bringing him closer to Sunday evening and the decision he still hadn't made. Would he accept Mrs. Thompson's invitation? The thought of walking to the Blue House on Oak Street, of sitting at a dinner table with strangers, made his palms sweat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself as he paced his living room. "I'm too old for this nonsense," but he knew it wasn't nonsense. It was connection, something he'd been avoiding for years, convincing himself he didn't need it, didn't want it. Now that the possibility of connection had been offered to him, he found himself both terrified and drawn to it. That evening, Roy did something he hadn't done in months. He called his son, David. "Dad?" David sounded surprised when he answered. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Roy said, realizing how his unexpected call must seem. He rarely initiated contact anymore. "Just thought I'd check in." There was a pause, and Roy could hear the sound of a television being turned down. "Well, I'm glad you called." "How are things?" Roy hesitated, then decided to just say it. "I helped someone the other day. A young woman who collapsed while running. Used that first aid training from the factory." "That's great, Dad," David said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. Works as a nurse at County. She and her grandmother brought me pie yesterday to say thank you." "They came to your apartment?" David couldn't hide the surprise in his voice, and Roy couldn't blame him. He hadn't had visitors in years. "Yes, sweet potato pie. Her grandmother invited me for Sunday dinner tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you going to go?" Roy sighed. "I don't know. It's been a long time since I spent time with people." "I think you should go," David said firmly. "It would be good for you." "Maybe," Roy conceded. "How are Beth and the kids?" They talked for another 20 minutes, longer than they had in years. David told him about his wife's new job, about his daughter's soccer team making the playoffs, about his son's interest in computer programming. Roy listened, asking questions, trying to be present in a way he hadn't been for a long time. When they hung up, Roy felt drained, but somehow lighter. The conversation had been awkward at times, with pauses and detours around difficult subjects, but it had also been real. It had been a start. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Roy went through his usual routine, but with an undercurrent of nervous energy. By noon, he had made his decision. He would go to dinner at the Blue House on Oak Street. This decision made, he faced another problem. He couldn't show up empty-handed. But what should he bring? He hadn't been to a dinner party in years. Flowers seemed too formal, wine too presumptuous. Finally, he remembered the small bakery near the corner store where he bought his newspaper. They made good bread. He'd treated himself to a loaf on his birthday last year. The walk to the bakery took him past familiar sights. But he noticed things he usually ignored. The new playground equipment in the small park. The freshly painted mural on the side of the community center. The vibrant vegetables displayed outside the International Market. At the bakery, Roy was greeted by a young man with a cheerful smile and flour-dusted hands. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today?" Roy cleared his throat. I'm going to a dinner at someone's house. I should bring something." The young man nodded knowingly. "First time visiting? How about a loaf of our sourdough? Just baked this morning." "That would be good," Roy said, relieved at the simple solution. The bread was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, looking both rustic and elegant. Roy paid, and as he turned to leave, the young baker called after him. "Hope you enjoy your dinner." Roy nodded, a little embarrassed but also pleased. It felt strange to have someone wish him well, to have his plans for the day acknowledged as important. Back home, Roy changed his shirt twice before settling on a blue button-up that his wife had always said brought out his eyes. He polished his old dress shoes, which had gathered dust in the back of his closet. At 4:30, he wrapped the bread in a clean dish towel to keep it warm and set out for Oak Street. The Blue House was impossible to miss, just as Mrs. Thompson had said. Not only was it painted a cheerful sky blue, but the small front yard was a riot of colorful flowers and ornamental shrubs. A hand-painted sign beside the door read, "Thompson Home, all welcome here." Roy stood at the gate for a long moment, his heart pounding. He could still turn back. No one had seen him yet. He could return to his apartment, to his solitude, to the life he knew. Then the front door opened and Mrs. Thompson appeared on the porch, waving as if she'd been watching for him. Mr. Wilson. Right on time. Come in, come in. There was no turning back now. Roy pushed open the gate and walked up the short path to the porch. I brought bread, he said, holding out his wrapped bundle. How thoughtful, Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, taking it from him. Fresh bread is always welcome at my table. Come in and meet everyone. Everyone? Roy hadn't considered that there might be other guests. He followed Mrs. Thompson into the house with growing apprehension. The inside of the Thompson home was as colorful and welcoming as the outside. Family photographs covered one wall. Bright cushions adorned the furniture, and the delicious smell of cooking filled the air. In the living room, a group of people were engaged in animated conversation. Zara spotted him first, rising from her seat to greet him. She looked much better than she had on Friday, with color in her cheeks and energy in her movements. Mr. Wilson, I'm so glad you came. She turned to the others. Everyone, this is Mr. Roy Wilson, the man who helped me when I collapsed. Roy found himself the center of attention as several people turned to look at him with friendly interest. This is my cousin Theo and his wife Lena, Zara introduced, gesturing to a young couple seated on the couch. And that's my Uncle Vernon, Grandma's brother. And this is Mrs. Patel from next door. Her son is the doctor I work with at the hospital. Everyone greeted him warmly, making space for him in their circle, including him in their conversation as if he belonged there. Roy sat stiffly at first, unused to so much social interaction, but gradually he began to relax. The Thompson family had a gift for making people feel welcome, for drawing them out without pressure. When dinner was ready, they moved to the dining room, where a large table was set with mismatched but charming dishes and glasses. The food was abundant and delicious: fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, and more sides than Roy could count. Mrs. Thompson is famous for her Sunday dinners, Theo told him as they filled their plates. No one leaves hungry, that's for sure. Been cooking Sunday dinners for 50 years, Mrs. Thompson said proudly. Started when I was just a girl helping my mama. Food brings people together better than anything else in this world. Throughout the meal, Roy found himself drawn into conversations about the neighborhood, about local politics, about memories of the town before the factory closed. To his surprise, the others were interested in his perspective, in his stories about how things used to be. The town has changed so much, Mrs. Patel said thoughtfully. My husband and I moved here 20 years ago, when the medical center was just being built. Even then it was different. Change isn't always bad, Vernon commented. Different, yes, but not always bad. Roy found himself nodding. I'm starting to see that, he admitted. Took me long enough. After dinner, when everyone had eaten their fill of sweet potato pie and coffee, the group moved back to the living room. Some of the younger folks stepped out to the back porch, while Vernon and Mrs. Patel engaged Roy in a conversation about the town's plans to convert the old factory, building into affordable apartments there, holding a community meeting. Next week at the library, Mrs. Patel informed him. You should come, Mr. Wilson. Your experience at the factory would be valuable to the discussion. Before Roy could respond, Zara joined them carrying a photo album. Look what I found. Mr. Wilson, she said, sitting beside him on the couch. Grandma's pictures of the neighborhood from when she first moved here. The album was filled with faded photographs of Oak Street and the surrounding area from 30 years before. Roy was surprised to recognize many of the buildings and landmarks, though they looked different now. That's Miller's Hardware, he said, pointing to a storefront in one image. It's the International Market now. And that's the old movie theater, before they turned it into the community center. You should come to our neighborhood association meetings, Mrs. Patel suggested. We're always looking for people who know the history of this place. By the time Roy prepared to leave, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The evening had passed more quickly and pleasantly than he had expected. At the door, Mrs. Thompson pressed a container of leftovers into his hands. For your lunch tomorrow, she insisted. And you must come again next Sunday. It's my birthday and I'm making my special peach cobbler. I'd like that, Roy said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Zara walked him to the gate. The evening was mild, with stars appearing in the darkening sky above. Thank you for coming, she said. It meant a lot to Grandma. To all of us, really. I should be thanking you, Roy replied. It's been a long time since I had a Sunday dinner like that. Zara smiled. Well, there's plenty more where that came from, Grandma feeds everyone she can get her hands on. As Roy walked home, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. The container of food was warm in his hands, like a tangible reminder that he had been included, that he mattered to someone. His apartment seemed smaller when he returned to it, emptier somehow. But for the first time in years, the emptiness didn't feel like peace or protection. It felt like absence. Roy placed the container of food in his refrigerator and noticed Mrs. Thompson's sweet potato pie, still half uneaten. On impulse, he cut himself another slice and sat at his kitchen table to eat it slowly, savoring each bite. "Things really are changing, Mary," he said aloud, looking at his wife's photograph on the wall, "and maybe that's not so bad after all." The week following that Sunday dinner passed differently than any week in Roy's recent memory. Instead of each day blending into the next in a monotonous routine, Roy found himself looking forward to things. Small things, perhaps, but they gave structure and meaning to his days. On Monday, he called David again, this time to ask about his grandchildren. The conversation flowed more easily than before, ending with a tentative plan for David to bring his family for a visit sometime soon. Tuesday morning, Roy decided to attend the community meeting about the old factory. He put on a clean shirt and walked to the library, where about 30 people had gathered in the meeting room. He recognized Mrs. Patel, who waved him over to sit beside her. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Wilson," she said warmly. "They need to hear from people who actually worked in that building." The meeting was led by a young woman from the city planning department, who explained the proposal to convert the abandoned factory into mixed-income apartments with community spaces on the ground floor. "We want to preserve the historical character of the building," she explained, showing architectural renderings on a projector screen, "but make it functional for today's needs." When she asked for comments, Roy surprised himself by raising his hand. Standing up, he cleared his throat nervously. "I worked in that factory for 38 years, he began. "Started on the assembly line when I was 18, retired as a shift supervisor. That building was the heart of this town for a long time." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "It's good to see it might have a purpose again, but there's history there worth preserving. The main entrance hall has murals painted in the 1930s showing the town's founding, and the old clock tower. It hasn't worked in 20 years, but it could be restored. It used to be how everyone in town knew what time it was." To Roy's surprise, several people nodded in agreement. The young woman from the planning department asked him detailed questions about the building's features, taking notes on his answers. "Would you be willing to walk through the building with our architects?" she asked. "Your knowledge would be invaluable to this project." "I'd be happy to," Roy replied, feeling a swell of pride that his years at the factory still mattered, that his knowledge was still useful. After the meeting, several people approached him to share their own memories of the factory, or stories told by parents and grandparents who had worked there. Roy found himself at the center of an impromptu historical society, with everyone eager to preserve the best parts of their shared past. Wednesday brought rain, keeping Roy indoors. But instead of watching television all day, he dug through his closet until he found a box of old photographs from his years at the factory. Company picnics, retirement parties, the softball team's championship game. He spent hours sorting through them, writing names and dates on the backs, creating a record of a community that had once been central to his life. Thursday morning, Roy was having coffee at his kitchen table when there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he felt a flash of his old wariness, but curiosity won out, and he opened the door to find Zara standing there in blue hospital scrubs holding a paper bag. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," she said brightly. "I'm on my way to work, but Grandma sent these over for you. Her famous cinnamon rolls." Roy accepted the bag, catching the sweet, spicy scent of fresh pastry. "That's very kind of her. And you to deliver them," Zara shrugged. "It's on my way to the hospital. Besides, Grandma wanted me to remind you about Sunday dinner. Her birthday celebration, remember?" "I remember," Roy assured her. "I wouldn't miss it." Zara smiled, seeming pleased by his answer. "Great, I have to run or I'll be late, but enjoy the cinnamon rolls." As she hurried down the hallway, Roy called after her, "Have a good day at work." She turned, walking backward for a few steps, and gave him a cheerful wave before disappearing down the stairs. Roy brought the cinnamon rolls to his kitchen and made a fresh pot of coffee. As he ate the sweet, sticky pastry, he realized it had been years since someone had thought to bring him homemade food on their way to work. Such a small gesture, but it made him feel cared for, remembered. Friday afternoon found Roy at the old factory, walking through the dusty, empty building with 2 architects and the woman from the city planning department. The factory had been closed for years, but Roy knew every corner of it like the back of his hand. This was the main production floor, he explained, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Over there was shipping and receiving. The administrative offices were upstairs. He showed them the murals he'd mentioned, faded but still beautiful, depicting the town's early days as a farming community and its growth during the industrial age. The architects took photographs and made notes asking Roy about the original layout, the building's quirks and features. The clock tower mechanism is still up there, Roy told them, pointing to a metal staircase that led to an upper level. Probably needs a lot of work, but it was a beautiful piece of engineering in its day. One of the architects, a middle-aged man named Luis, climbed the stairs with Roy to examine the clockworks. "My grandfather was a clockmaker in Mexico," Luis said as they studied the rusted gears and springs. "This is similar to mechanisms he worked on. It could definitely be restored. It would mean a lot to the old-timers in town," Roy said, "and maybe to the new folks too, to have that connection to the past." By the time they finished the tour, Roy was tired, but satisfied. The planning team had listened to his suggestions and seemed genuinely interested in preserving the historical elements of the building while giving it new purpose. "We'd like to include some historical displays in the community areas," the planner told him as they prepared to leave. "Would you be willing to help us collect photographs and stories from former factory workers?" "I'd be happy to," Roy said, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Saturday, Roy spent the morning at Mrs. Chen's flower shop, selecting a birthday gift for Mrs. Thompson. "So you're going to Vivian Thompson's birthday dinner," Mrs. Chen said as she helped him choose an arrangement. "She's a wonderful woman. Her garden is the envy of the neighborhood." "I didn't know you knew her," Roy said, surprised. Mrs. Chen laughed. "Of course I know her. She's been buying flowers from me for 15 years, and we're in the same garden club." Roy felt a pang of regret for all the connections he'd missed over the years, all the relationships that had formed around him while he remained isolated. "What kind of flowers does she like best?" he asked. "Dahlias," Mrs. Chen replied without hesitation. "The bright orange ones remind her of Georgia sunsets, she always says." Roy left the shop with a beautiful arrangement of orange and yellow dahlias, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a ribbon. Mrs. Chen had included a card, which Roy carefully filled out at his kitchen table. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for your kindness and your excellent cooking, Roy Wilson." The words seemed inadequate to express his gratitude, not just for the meals, but for the way she and her family had drawn him back into the world. But it would have to do. Sunday arrived with perfect early autumn weather. Warm sunshine, cool breeze, clear blue sky. Roy dressed carefully in slacks and his best shirt, combed his thinning hair, and even put on a dab of the aftershave his son had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. The walk to the Blue House on Oak Street felt different this time. Instead of anxiety, Roy felt anticipation. He noticed neighbors working in their yards who nodded to him as he passed. He stopped to admire a classic car being washed in a driveway, exchanging a few words with its proud owner. By the time he reached the Thompson home, Roy felt part of the neighborhood in a way he hadn't in years. Not just someone who lived there, but someone who belonged there. The Blue House was even more lively than the previous Sunday. Balloons decorated the porch, and the sounds of music and laughter spilled from the open windows. Roy squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and opened the gate. Before he could reach the porch, the front door opened and Zara rushed out to greet him. "Mr. Wilson, you're here?" she exclaimed, as if his arrival was the highlight of her day. "And you brought flowers. Grandma will be thrilled." She led him inside, where the living room and dining room had been transformed with streamers and balloons. More people than last week had gathered to celebrate Mrs. Thompson's birthday. Family members, neighbors, friends from church and garden club. Roy recognized some faces from the previous Sunday and from around town, but many were new to him. In the center of it all was Mrs. Thompson, elegant in a purple dress, her silver hair styled for the occasion. When she spotted Roy, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mr. Wilson, you came." She crossed the room to greet him, accepting the flowers with delight. Dahlias! My favorite. How did you know? A little bird told me, Roy said, nodding toward Mrs. Chen, who was chatting with Vernon across the room. Mrs. Thompson laughed. Well, I'm so glad you're here. Come, let me introduce you to everyone. For the next hour, Roy was drawn from group to group, introduced as my friend Roy Wilson, who used to work at the factory. He shared stories about the factory days, listened to tales about Mrs. Thompson's 68 years of life, and gradually felt himself becoming part of the celebration rather than just an observer. During dinner, an even more elaborate spread than the previous Sunday, Roy found himself seated between Zara and a friendly man named Paul, who turned out to be the music teacher at the local high school. I hear you're helping with the factory renovation project, Zara said as they ate. That's wonderful. Just sharing what I know, Roy said modestly. But yes, it feels good to be involved. The town needs more of that, Paul commented. People connecting the past to the present, helping us remember where we came from while we figure out where we're going. After dinner came the birthday cake. 3 tiers of peach cobbler instead of traditional cake, just as Mrs. Thompson had promised. As everyone sang happy birthday and Mrs. Thompson blew out her candles, Roy felt a lump in his throat. How close he had come to missing this, to remaining alone in his apartment while life went on without him. Later, as the party continued around them, Zara found Roy sitting quietly on the porch, taking a brief break from the noise and activity inside. Everything okay? She asked, sitting beside him on the porch swing. Everything's fine, he assured her. Just needed a moment of quiet. It's been a while since I've been around so many people. Zara nodded understandingly. It can be overwhelming. But you're doing great. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. You know, Zara said finally, when I collapsed that day I was having the worst week. Double shifts, a patient we couldn't save, trouble with my car. I felt like everything was going wrong. She turned to look at him directly, but now I think it was one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me. If I hadn't collapsed right there, right then, we might never have met. And Grandma wouldn't have her newest dinner guest, and you wouldn't be helping with the factory project. Funny how things work out, Roy agreed softly. Life has a way of surprising us, Zara said, standing up as Mrs. Thompson called from inside that it was time for music and dancing. Coming? Roy hesitated only briefly before taking her offered hand. Coming, he said, and followed her back into the warmth and noise and life of the celebration. 6 months passed, and with them came changes both small and profound in Roy Wilson's life. Autumn turned to winter, bringing holidays that Roy had dreaded for years. But this year was different. For Thanksgiving, he joined the Thompson family feast, contributing his late wife's cranberry relish recipe, which Mrs. Thompson declared absolutely divine and immediately added to her permanent holiday menu. For Christmas, to his own surprise, Roy hosted his son David and his family in his small apartment. He'd spent weeks preparing, buying an artificial tree, his first in 5 years, clearing out his spare room that had become a storage space, purchasing gifts for his grandchildren with Zara's help. The visit had its awkward moments. Years of distance couldn't be erased in a few days, but it was a beginning. A bridge being rebuilt. You seem different, Dad? David had said on their last night after the children had gone to bed. More like how I remember you from before Mom died. Roy had nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the lump in his throat. Later, after they'd left, he'd called David just to say thank you for coming. Another small step toward healing their relationship. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing season came the grand opening of what was now called Heritage Apartments, the renovated factory building that had once been the heart of the town. Roy stood proudly among the dignitaries at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, acknowledged by the mayor for his contributions to preserving the building's history. The clock tower had been restored, its bell ringing out the hours once again. The murals in the entrance hall had been carefully cleaned and preserved, now accompanied by historical photographs and stories collected from former workers. One wall featured a large photograph of the factory softball team, holding their championship trophy, with a young Roy Wilson grinning in the front row. The ground floor included community spaces, a small museum about the town's industrial past, and a cafe that employed local youth. The upper floors housed apartments, with 30% designated as affordable housing for seniors and low-income families. We couldn't have done this without you. Mr. Wilson, the young woman from the city planning department told him at the opening reception. Your knowledge and passion for this place inspired everyone on the project. Now it was early summer, almost exactly 6 months since Roy had found Zara collapsed on the sidewalk. That moment, which had seemed so insignificant at the time, had changed the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. This particular Saturday found Roy in Mrs. Thompson's backyard, seated at a picnic table surrounded by familiar faces. Zara had passed her certification exam to become a nurse practitioner, and Mrs. Thompson had insisted on throwing a celebration party. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Zara had protested, but her grandmother had waved away her objections. When someone achieves something important, you celebrate, Mrs. Thompson had declared. That's just how it is. So here they were, gathered in the lush garden that was Mrs. Thompson's pride and joy, eating barbecue and homemade sides, congratulating Zara on her achievement. Roy watched her move among her guests, accepting congratulations with a mix of pride and humility that reminded him of his own daughter-in-law. Penny for your thoughts, said a voice beside him, and Roy turned to find Mrs. Chen taking a seat next to him, a plate of food in her hands. Just thinking about how much things have changed, Roy replied honestly. Mrs. Chen nodded, looking around the yard at the gathered friends and family. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? 6 months ago, I don't think either of us imagined we'd be here. Roy had to agree. In the months since he'd helped Zara, he'd become a regular not just at Mrs. Thompson's Sunday dinners, but at community meetings, at Mrs. Chen's flower shop, at the small cafe in the renovated factory building where he met other retired workers every Wednesday morning. His apartment was still his home, but it was no longer his entire world. Now it was just one of many places where his life happened. He'd even started volunteering twice a week at the local elementary school, helping children learn to read, something Zara had suggested when she noticed how good he was with David's children during their Christmas visit. Roy, called Mrs. Thompson from across the yard, come tell Vernon about the clock tower dedication next week. He doesn't believe they used the original bell. Roy excused himself to Mrs. Chen and made his way across the yard, stopping to chat briefly with Paul and his wife, with Luis and his children, with Mrs. Patel, who was helping serve drinks. These people who had been strangers 6 months ago were now his friends, his community. The party continued as afternoon turned to evening. Someone brought out a guitar and Paul led everyone in singing. String lights came on in the trees as darkness fell, creating a magical atmosphere in the garden. During a quiet moment, Zara found Roy sitting alone on the porch steps, watching the celebration from a slight distance. Taking a break from the crowd? She asked, sitting beside him. Roy nodded. Just for a minute. It's a wonderful party. Grandma does know how to throw one, Zara agreed, though I told her it was too much fuss for just passing an exam. It's a big achievement, Roy said. You worked hard for it. You deserve to be celebrated. Zara smiled, accepting the compliment. Thank you. And thank you for coming today. It means a lot to me. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment watching the party. Mrs. Thompson was teaching some of the younger children a dance step, her movements still graceful despite her age. Vernon was deep in conversation with Luis about something that involved enthusiastic hand gestures. Mrs. Chen was arranging flowers from the garden in a vase, making an impromptu centerpiece for the picnic table. You know, Zara said finally, I've been meaning to tell you something, but I wasn't sure how. Roy turned to look at her, concerned by the sudden seriousness in her voice. What is it? Zara took a deep breath. Remember the day we met? When I collapsed? Of course, Roy said. How could he forget the day that had changed everything? Well, I never told you exactly why I collapsed, Zara continued. The doctor said it was dehydration and low blood sugar, which was true, but there was more to it. She looked down at her hands, then back up at Roy. I was running that day because I was upset, really upset. I'd lost a patient, a young man who reminded me of my brother who passed away years ago. And then I got a call that the nursing home where my father is, he has early onset Alzheimer's, needed to increase his care, which meant more money that I didn't have. Roy listened silently, letting her tell her story. I felt so overwhelmed, so alone with it all, Zara continued. I went running to clear my head, but I hadn't eaten or drunk anything all day. I remember feeling dizzy, then nothing, until I woke up in the ambulance. She met Roy's eyes directly. When I opened my eyes for that brief moment, the first face I saw was yours, a stranger looking worried about me, caring about what happened to me. It meant more than you could know. Roy felt a tightness in his chest at her words. I just did what anyone would do, Zara smiled gently. But they didn't, you did. And look what came from that moment, all of this. She gestured at the party, at the community gathered in the garden. You became part of our family. You helped save the clock tower and the murals. You reconnected with your son. You're teaching kids to read. She put her hand on his, a brief touch of warmth. One moment of kindness changed everything for both of us. Before Roy could respond, Mrs. Thompson called from the garden. Zara? Roy, come back and join us. We're about to cut the cake. They returned to the party where Mrs. Thompson had produced a beautiful cake decorated with congratulations for Zara. Everyone gathered around as she blew out the candles, making a wish that she refused to reveal despite the good-natured teasing from her cousins. As slices of cake were passed around, Vernon tapped his glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. I'd like to make a toast, he announced, raising his glass. To my niece Zara, who has worked so hard to achieve her dream. We are all so proud of you. Everyone raised their glasses, cheering for Zara, who blushed but stood proudly, accepting their good wishes. And, Vernon continued, I'd like to toast someone else as well. Someone who became part of our family through an act of kindness, and who has since shown us all what it means to open your heart to new possibilities. He turned to Roy, raising his glass higher. To Roy Wilson, who reminds us that it's never too late to begin again, to find community, to make a difference. To Roy, echoed the gathered friends and family, turning to him with smiles and raised glasses. Roy felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. Gratitude, belonging, purpose, feelings he had thought were behind him forever. He raised his own glass, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, but his eyes said everything his voice could not. Later that night, walking home under a sky full of stars, Roy thought about Zara's words. One moment of kindness had indeed changed everything. He had helped her when she needed it, but she, and her family and this community, had saved him in return. Saved him from loneliness, from bitterness, from a life grown small and cold. As he approached his apartment building, he noticed something he'd never seen before. How the moonlight silvered the leaves of the old oak tree in the small front yard. How the windows of his neighbors' apartments glowed with warm light. How the sounds of the neighborhood at night, distant music, a dog barking, someone's laughter, created a kind of symphony of shared life. This place had always been his address, but now it was truly his home. These people had always been his neighbors, but now they were his community. And for the first time in years, Roy Wilson walked through his front door feeling not relief at escaping the world, but gratitude for being part of it. He paused in his darkened living room, looking at the photograph of his late wife that had been his primary companion for so many years. You were right, Mary, he said softly. It was about time, and I'm only sorry it took me so long to see it. Then he turned on the lights, put on the kettle for tea, and began planning his lesson for Monday's reading group at the elementary school. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant dinner at the Blue House on Oak Street. And beyond that stretched days and weeks and months full of purpose, of connection, of life being lived rather than simply endured. One moment of kindness had changed everything. And Roy Wilson, a man who had once defined himself by what he had lost, now defined himself by what he had found: community, purpose, and a heart open once again to all the possibilities of life.